Hi there and welcome to Lab 1 of the Data Lake in a Day workshop. So we've already set up the infrastructure in the previous video. If you've not seen that, there should be a link below. Go back and watch that first, run through it and get the infrastructure set up and the data imported into SQL. So in today's lab, we're going to cover taking that data and ingesting it into the data lake. We're going to do this by using Azure Data Factory. This is going to go and connect out to that SQL Server via an integration runtime. So we are pretending that the SQL Server is on-premise, and therefore we're going to use that integration runtime to reach outwards through the firewall into the Data Factory so that it's nice and secure. There's no incoming ports on the firewall to connect to that SQL Server. We're then going to use a tumbling window trigger to get the data in chunks. So the tumbling window allows us to, for instance, set up an hourly window, and we then go and get the data for that hour. This means that we're absolutely in control of what's coming within each of the trigger runs, whereas a scheduled task is just going to trigger the entire process, for instance, once an hour, and go and get absolutely everything from that SQL database, or you would then be in charge of what you're going to get. Whereas the tumbling window gives us a variable for the start and a variable for the end, so we can actually run a query to get the specific data we want. This is really powerful because it means then if something fails, or if you get a restatement from a retailer, or if for any other reason your data is later updated with different figures, maybe you did a stock count and the stock has changed, this means that you can then rerun a specific window of time from any time in the past, rerun that, ingest the data into the lake, and then reprocess that so that all of your analytics processes are working against the correct data. And this is a very efficient way of running a data lake, but it may be a bit alien to people that are used to just running a script on a scheduled task. This is really worthwhile technique to learn. I've used it in several demos in the past, so please go back and watch some of those if you want to become more familiar with this. So with that, we'll start the demo, and hope you enjoy it. If you do, please click subscribe below. It really helps the channel out. Also hit that like button. Again, that just helps the YouTube algorithm to show us up on the feed. Thanks very much. So the first thing that we need to do on this is to configure the containers on the storage account. So these are going to be areas on your data lake that we're going to store some information. So we're going to create a raw and a model. There'll be another session around this later on in the series to discuss structure of a data lake and where you'd like to put things. There's a concept of layers that a lot of people talk about. But for this demo, raw is just going to be our incoming data, and model is, after we've processed it, that's the data that we're then going to load off into the database. So now that we've got the landing areas of the data lake configured, we're going to go about setting up the actual ingest of the data. And because in this demo we are connecting to a SQL Server that is representing an on-premises server, we're going to set up the integration runtime. So you've got a virtual machine called IR followed by a random string. Go into this and click on the connect button, and then we're going to connect via RDP. So the purpose of this integration runtime is a kind of a proxy to reach into your network and take data out. It's just got an outgoing TLS connection on port 443, so there's no incoming firewall rules required. This means that we can safely and securely get data up into the data lake without too much configuration. So once we've logged into the server, we're going to go to Server Manager, which should pop up automatically because this is the first login. Go to Local Server and just turn off the Enhanced Security configuration on Internet Explorer. This is going to allow us to download the setup program for the integration runtime. So next, go to the Data Lake in a Day instructions for Lab 1 and just copy out this, this link here. This is where you can get that program from. There's also a link in Data Factory if you need to get it from there. It was just quicker for the demo to get it from this existing link. So go to that link and download the latest version. Obviously it's x64, and run that download. So you'll notice a lot of this section is sped up This is basically a download and then just next type installation. So run the installer and then click next, accept the license agreement, and just go through and click install. So this will take a few minutes. I sped this up quite a bit just for the convenience of the video and to stop it getting too boring for you guys. So once that completes, it will then automatically launch the configurations. So for this, we need to go back into our Data Factory. So go to the resource group and launch the ADF Data Factory and go to author and monitor. Once you're in there, go to the author section and then you'll need to go to connections. So this is recently moved. I'm showing it on the screen for any of you guys that are already familiar with the tool. There's actually a whole new configuration section now, so just go to Integration Runtimes and click on New, and then choose Self-Hosted. Follow the wizard through here, choosing Self-Hosted, give it a name, and possibly a description if you like doing that kind of stuff. Obviously I'd recommend descriptions in a real production scenario, and then copy one of the two keys. And then we're going to paste that into the window within the configuration wizard back on the Integration Runtime server. So just paste that in, click on register. So what it's doing here is a certificate exchange. So the Integration Runtime has an outgoing connection to Azure. It uses this certificate to tell Azure that it is who is expected. And then Azure does a sort of key exchange so that they both know who each other are. So we've got that authentication type thing going on. So close all that, and then important part, hit refresh and just make sure that your integration runtime is recognized as running. So the first thing that we need to do to ingest data using Data Factory is set up our linked services. These are just connections to things that you want to read data from, or to write data to, or for a compute instance that's going to transform the data. So the first one we're going to do is blob storage. Just use the drop down boxes to select the storage account that was created as part of the setup for Data Lake in a Day. It takes a couple of seconds to find the list, and your storage account will be called data store, and then have that same random string of characters on it. So always click test the connection, and that should come back successfully completed, and then just click create. Once that's done, click new again, and we're going to create the connection to the SQL Server. So use the search box, just type SQL and select SQL Server. Hit continue, and then we'll give the service a name, and I'm going to type SQL01 as the computer name. And importantly, we're going to connect using that demo integration runtime, not using the Azure Integration Runtime. This is because the Azure Integration Runtime doesn't have access to the SQL Server because it's not on the right network. So the database name is sales, and again the username is demogod, and password $123 with a capital P if you use that as your password. So again, test it. The connection should be successful. All of the firewalling and stuff was done automatically during deployment, and that's the linked services completed. So next we're going to configure the datasets, and in Data Factory, datasets are the description of the actual data. So you could think of these as referring to a table. They'll include some kind of schema, and this allows us to know what data we're getting and know what data we're going to be putting down at the end. So you could have an incoming schema and an outgoing schema and have them different. So click on the plus and select new dataset, and then we're going to give it a name called delimited text customers, and choose the link service of Azure Blob Storage 1 that we just configured. Then we're going to choose the raw folder and the file path of customers. So we're effectively going to create a folder per customer, per dataset, and then we're going to choose first row as header so that these CSVs end up with the column names as a header row. We've got 3 tables to do, so we've got customers, This contains obviously customer details and a customer number, just like any sales system. We're going to have an orders table. This will include the actual records of orders, and then we'll have an order items table that includes the records of what items were actually within each order. So we're storing these in the raw container because it's incoming data. We're not going to transform it in any way at this point. We're just going to take the data as is, write it to disk, and this is called the load section of the extract load transform, which is slightly different than a traditional extract transform load, ETL. So the idea here is that we are loading to the data lake, then we're going to transform it with some kind of a massively parallel tool. And finally, we'll obviously load it into some kind of query engine. So the second data set is going to also be a delimited text, and just going to configure it exactly as the first one as well as the third. And each time we're just going to call the directory the same thing as the table name that's in SQL. So one for customers, one called orders, and one called order items. Each time we're not going to import the schema because there are no files there just yet. So next we're going to do the SQL datasets. This is exactly the same process as what we've just been through for the CSVs. Apart from this time, we're going to search for SQL Server as the dataset type. So this just means it's connecting to a SQL database, but the process is effectively the same. So again, we're going to create 3 of them, one for customers, one for orders, and one for order items. And the link service is going to be the SQL Server. And then we're going to choose the relevant table name from the drop-down. But this time we're going to get the schema from the connection to SQL. So what this means is that Data Factory is going to connect to SQL, look at the schema, and say, okay, there are 5 columns there, one string and a couple of integers, and we're just going to copy that as the schema. This means that we don't really have to do quite so much setup for this configuration. And when we later do the copy job, we're going to take that schema and just copy it straight onto the CSV files. So again, we're not going to have to configure the CSV files. So as you can see, we're just going to repeat this for the remaining tables and get those datasets configured. So now I'm just going to do a bit of admin and create a couple of folders, one for SQL datasets, one for raw datasets, and I'm going to just move those datasets into those folders to make it easier to navigate the interface. Then I'm going to hit publish all. So it's a good idea to hit publish all every now and then if you're not working with a Git repository, just to kind of save your work. You can only do this when the entire environment validates, so it's a good idea to do it anytime that the environment is ready to validate and nothing is left kind of half done. So once that finishes publishing, you'll get a little pop-up saying publishing completed. And next we're going to create a new pipeline. And the pipeline is going to house any tasks that we need to do to move the data or to transform the data, or it can kick off other tasks in other platforms. So we're going to call it pipeline data copy. And this is going to be where all of our data sets are copied from SQL into the data lake in our raw container. So first things first, we're going to create a couple of parameters. These parameters are going to take the runtime of the tumbling window that we're going to use later for the start and the finish, so that we know what data to get. So we're just going to use, with our trigger, we're going to get the data from the start to the end of this job so that we can rerun it in case any data is later modified or changed. So we're going to copy a copy data task into the pipeline. And we're going to put 3 of these, one for each of the data sets. This allows the tool to run things in parallel where it can. So there are limits on the parallelization of the tool, but usually those are kind of bigger than what you would need. So again, we're going to rename these to the same as our 3 tables. So one for copy customers, one for copy orders, and one for copy order items. And initially we're just going to configure these as straight copies, and then we're going to do some changes to one of them a little bit later. So first things first, start on copy customers. go to the source tab and just drop down and select the SQL Server table customers. This is where the source of our data is. And then for the sync, we're going to choose the delimited text customers. So it's very straightforward, just pointing one to the other for this table, because in the case of customers, we're going to copy all of the customer table every single time this runs, just to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date copy. There are lots of different ways of doing these copies, so you can choose to take only the new items, or you can choose to take the whole thing. Sometimes it is actually quicker to get the whole thing. It puts less stress on a SQL Server, for instance, if we take the whole table, if it's small, rather than trying to do a sort by date or any of that kind of thing. So right at the end there, you would have seen I also changed the file extension of the sync to .csv, just so that the outputs are in a file format and we can recognize that when we look at them later. So for the final data copy activity for copy orders, we're going to do it slightly differently. So this time, again, we're going to choose the SQL Server table orders, but this time we're going to select query. And if you go over to the repo and look through the instructions, you'll find this select statement. So what I've just highlighted there is the statement that we're going to run, which is getting data between the start and end time. I just wrote that query as a test. And then this at the bottom is in the language that we kind of have to put it in to get the parameters into the Data Factory format. So effectively what this is doing is concatenating the SQL query with those parameters so that we can get all of the symbols in that we need. If we just loaded the symbols directly, then it wouldn't go through, just because of the formatting rules of the query. So for the sync, we're going to choose delimited text orders. And then this time we're just going to click this open button. This flicks us over to another tab in the interface to look at the actual data set that we created earlier. You could click on it on the menu on the left. So here we're going to add a parameter, and for this one it is going to be run start time. This is so that we can then name the file for the date that we're getting the data in. So head over to the file box at the end of the file path, and then we're going to add dynamic content, and here we're just going to put this parameter in. And we're going to format the date, so we're getting the full date stamp format from the parameter, because that's the way that we're given it from Data Factory. And we're going to do year month day.csv to make sure that we can very easily now going forwards find the day's data. So you've got to be careful here not to make your data files too big, but for this demo we're going right down to the day. And then going back into the copy activity, we need to pass the parameter through. So these are not global parameters. The first one comes from the trigger, goes into the pipeline passes it to the copy activity, which passes it through to the data set for the naming. And we were also using the run start time and run end time in that query so that we can get the correct data. So again, we're going to do a publish all here because we're in a validate state, so everything will currently work as it is. That saves all of our work, and then we can go on and configure the trigger. So you'll just see that publishing and then a success come up. And once that success has come through, we're going to add a trigger. So we're going to do it from the pipeline window so that it's associated with the pipeline. You can also manually go into the trigger section, add the trigger, and then link it back later, but this just saves that step. So we're going to call it trigger tumbling window and choose tumbling window. So this means we're going to get an explicit window of time for the run, and the Data Factory product will create a run for each of those windows. And that means that we can rerun any given window if we get a restatement from a retailer or that kind of thing. So for this demo, based on the data set that I've created, we're going to start at the 1st of the 7th, 2018 at midnight. And we're going to go every 24 hours. So each tumbling window will be exactly 1 day. And then for an end date, we can put that into the future. So we'll put it at the end of this year. And again, we're going to do that 1 minute to midnight just so that we get the correct number of tumbling windows. So once we run this, it's actually going to create tumbling windows all the way back to the start date, and it's not going to create them into the future. So if we decide to cancel this, we won't have to go and clear anything up. These are generated on the fly each day. But it also means that we could delete all of the data in the data lake, recreate the trigger going back to 2 years ago, and it will go and actually rehydrate the data in the lake back to 2 years ago. So it's a very useful technique. It's not like a schedule. So if we had a schedule, we'd have to have the first task get the data from the last 2 years, which would require extra programming. Whereas with this, we just choose a date and it will get the data for that date range. So as you saw as well, we left this job as activated. And then when we get to the parameters, go back into the Git repository and just copy the text in there. So all this is doing is taking the date time from the trigger, which is a global variable within Data Factory, and we're just formatting it with year, month, day, hour, minute, second, so that we get the full date stamp. And then we're clicking OK and publishing. So that's then going to create all of the trigger runs and start running those jobs. So if we hit refresh under the monitor tab, we can start seeing that there will be hundreds of these jobs getting created. And you can see they're all in progress. They'll run one at a time right up until it gets to the current date and time, and then it stops creating jobs. So we can then look into some of these jobs and we can start seeing the data that's been created. So you might need to hit refresh a few times, maybe scroll to the bottom to find the jobs that have actually completed. But once you do that, you can then just click on any individual one of these jobs to click into it, see how many rows that have been copied, and see the status of that job. So you get quite a nice display of everything that has been successful. You can then click further into some of these to get the status. Then if you click back to your data lake and go into the storage account and just look under the container, you should start seeing the CSV files being created. Under customers, we can then click through that and click on edit just to see the content of that. And if you want to, you can go back and check that against the SQL Server to make sure that those datasets match. We can also take a look into orders now and see that that's created one file per day with that name as we configured using the parameter within the run. So just to recap, this lab has shown you a configuration with a SQL Server sitting in your data center. In this lab, obviously it's in Azure, but it's representative. It's got its own virtual network. We've installed an integration runtime on a separate server there, and all of that is sitting within the corporate firewall. Then in the cloud side, we've got Data Factory and a storage blob. And as you'll see from the second diagram, all of that fits together so that the integration runtime is actually reaching outwards through the firewall on port 443 in a secure way with very little firewall configuration, so that Data Factory can then reach back into the network over that connection and take data from SQL and copy it into the storage blob. So that's it for this demo. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and you're now a bit more familiar with the way that ADF works, and you understand the kind of a data lake is just a bunch of files that we've created from data, and then we're going to transform them later on. So the purpose of this lab really was to show how simple it is to get the data in, how quickly you can get your data lake up and running, and really start processing that data and getting value from the platform. So the next lab is going to be using logic apps, and we're going to go out and get some weather data from the internet using an API call. This is going to give us extra data that we can enrich our sales data with. So it might be useful to find out if we are making more sales on a hot day, or if we're making more sales on a cold day, or if it's raining, people are going shopping more, or that kind of thing. This is just one example of enriching data with other data sources outside of your organization. And quite often we're going to need to do an API call or something like that to go and get that data regularly. You may also have partners such as Nielsen Sales Data who are going to send you data, and you're going to need a way of getting that data into the data lake other than just connecting to your own databases. So hopefully see you next time. If you enjoyed this, again, please hit the subscribe button and hit that like button. It really does help the channel. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time.